Hello, and welcome to Today in the World, where I discuss the news from around the world and I guess giving you a little bit of my thoughts on the situation. So, shocking no one, in Venezuela, the Supreme Court had certified Maduro's claims that he won the presidential election. They claimed that the opposing vote totals were forged. This comes from reporting done by the Wall Street Journal. Um, So Maduro, after the disputed election results, had tasked the Venezuelan Supreme Court with refereeing the disputed vote to fight fraud in the elections and completely disregarding the fact that the Venezuelan Supreme Court is controlled by his regime. That's a solid way to ensure you win the election. This is reportedly his latest attempt to blunt international criticism after his July 28th vote. Um, Reportedly, the ruling comes down from the Supreme Court saying that the opposition's vote totals were forged, but this does contradict findings of supposed experts from the UN who were invited to observe the election. Um, so, from what I have read, the official vote tallies that came from the actual voting machines have a unique QR code on them, which is almost impossible to replicate. I don't know much about how to make a QR code. I have no idea how hard it would be to replicate one. This is just what the UN experts are saying. And then also just a little extra icing on the cake. Um, I'm sure, I'm sure we've talked about this before. We've heard this before. It's just humorous when we have all these things come out where he's trying to legitimize his rule. When in previous elections this was a lot more unnecessary because in previous elections there was a breakdown of voting results by each of the 30,000 voting booths nationwide. And every election previously, not every election previously, but the previous election anyway, this breakdown of how everything was voted was released nationwide. Um, And I guess because of the Supreme Court's ruling in Venezuela, it looks like this has caused the other South American countries to lose a bit of steam in their efforts to pressure Maduro to release the vote totals or have a re an election again. Um, yeah, it was the three other leftist countries in the region. Um, and it looks like they have decided to focus more on stabilizing relations with Venezuela rather than pressing Maduro to yield power. I can't really blame them because they can press and press as much as they want, but this late in the game, there's no shot he's going to give up power. Like, it's incredibly unlikely. I guess, yeah. They don't really get anything out of questioning the results or trying to attack him when he's not going to give up power. There's no reward for doing that. It makes far more sense for them to just drop it, to recognize him as the leader, to ensure that relations between their countries are good. Um, it also doesn't help that these countries don't really have a way of pressuring him or leveraging Maduro that would get him out of control. Um, because like that is something that the U.S. has been trying to do for a while with the sanctions, especially the oil sanctions that the U.S. has placed on Venezuela. However, with the coming death of the petrodollar, it's only a matter of time before these oil sanctions that the U.S. has imposed will kind of lose power. Really, it's only a matter of before the U.S. loses leverage, any leverage it might have over Venezuela's arguably largest export, oil. Plus, I mean, he has the backing of countries like Russia and China. So there's only so much that U.S. sanctions can do. There's only so much that oil sanctions can do. And I mean, it's only so long that those oil sanctions are going to last anyway. So I guess we will have to wait another 6 years when they're supposed to have another election. It's I doubt that if they decide to shift power to a different person, that it will come via election. I would be moderately surprised if they actually had democratic elections in Venezuela. I think it would be more like a shifting of the guard or a handoff of power. But really, at this point, who knows? We could even see a coup attempt from the military, considering we've seen so many coup attempts from militaries over and over again. It would not be surprising. But any real democratic change coming to that country is very unlikely. And then we come to Indonesia, where they had protests that erupted in the capital of Jakarta, where protesters were attempting to storm parliament due to proposed changes in the election laws. Um, this is because the proposed changes to the election laws looked like they would enhance the political influence of the current president of Indonesia. This report was done by Channel News Asia out of Singapore, that Indonesia lawmakers have shelved plans to change election laws as the protests rage. They haven't decided to not make election law changes, but what they have decided was to make the changes at a time where it wouldn't benefit the current parliament and at a time when the current president would be out of office. That's anyway what's being reported. Indonesia's legislature will not ratify changes to election rules during the current government's term, was how it was reported. Um, they are saying this is due to the demonstrations that were ongoing outside of Parliament, where security forces had used tear gas and water cannons to disperse protesters. And we can dig a little bit into the details, um, just because it was a little different, like some of the details than what I was expecting. So apparently, what was involved in the changes that were coming to the election law was a reversing of a court ruling which would block a local government critic from running for Jakarta's governorship. And then it also would have allowed the ruling president's youngest son to run for elections for the governorship of Central Java. So it absolutely does look like nepotism. We'll come to it a little bit more later. By later, I mean like a minute. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the eldest son is doing. But I think what people are really worried about is allowing elected people to change election laws. Obviously, I think there's a conflict of interest there, especially when you change election laws to benefit the people who have been elected. And 9 times out of 10, when you're changing election laws, that's exactly what you're doing. Interestingly, the attempted change to the election laws does come amid a power struggle between the parliament and the court. I have also seen reporting that they delayed the election rule changes because they had seen low attendance in parliament that day, but that seems kind of like a way that they're just trying to save face, essentially. I doubt that's the reason they did it. I just had to add that in there because it's a little ridiculous. And it like especially doesn't help because the president's eldest son was named Indonesia's youngest vice president. And because they have a 2 year term limit, and this is the current president's second term that's coming to an end, he has to step down. And the changes that they wanted to make to the election law was basically allowing him to maintain his political influence after he left office. he would absolutely have had a role in any future laws that were being proposed and all sorts of things like that, right? Like he wanted to essentially what it looked like was he wanted to have a political dynasty almost with his family where he was trying to almost manipulate the democratic system to maintain power. Not necessarily in like a shadow government or a puppeteering way, but being able to hold influence after he's president onto the next president, onto other governors and things like that, and then preventing any critics of his government to get into office elsewhere. And I think like we often see this in a lot of democracies where people who have left office maintain far more influence than they should after they left office. Um, like it's almost a case where they, because there are no laws against it, they're not technically abusing the law, but they're almost abusing people's will to retain as much power as possible. Off the top of my head, I can think of several people who hold a lot more political influence out of office than they should, allegedly. If you know what I'm referring to. Yeah, anyway. Um, and this brings us to the ceasefire for the Israel and Hamas conflict, which is unlikely to get off the ground due to Hamas. Um, they're not okay with the proposals in the ceasefire that would allow Israel to police their borders between South and North Gaza, as well as the border with Egypt. I do want to note that Egypt is also not okay with Israel policing the border between Gaza and Egypt. I can think of several reasons why. Um, Obviously, the Egypt and Gaza border, the Philippaldi border, I believe it's called, is where smuggling into Gaza occurs. Any smuggling they do in terms of weapons, anything else they might smuggle in, parts to build bombs, things like that. I suppose, like, I don't know what they were hoping to get out of the terrorist attack, other than horribly demolished or a genocide or a horrible ceasefire for them. I think this is just the result of their actions. If you don't want other people policing your borders, you shouldn't randomly attack people outside your borders. I think that just goes without saying, honestly. I think also Israel wants control of the north south Gaza border, specifically to prevent movement of Hamas fighters. So there has been apparently a new ceasefire agreement that has been sent to both Hamas and Israel after Blinken's extended trip to the Middle East. We haven't seen the details of this proposal yet, but it's unlikely that the current ceasefire proposal includes a road to a permanent ceasefire. It's more likely that this text includes a 6-week ceasefire proposal to allow for the exchanging of hostages and prisoners. Um, Hamas has been saying that there was an older version of the ceasefire where if they had lived up to their commitments, the temporary ceasefire would have turned into a permanent ceasefire. And also, um, reportedly in the new ceasefire proposal, is that any prisoners that Israel releases would be deported or would go into exile outside of Israel, outside of the West Bank, and outside of Gaza. Obviously, they want to do this, to include this in the ceasefire, to ensure that terrorists do not get to rejoin their terror cells. That does make sense. I honestly think that's a pretty valid request to make. And I could be wrong. I don't know a whole lot about the politics in the Middle East, but I don't think we're going to end up with a permanent ceasefire in the region, especially considering the horrible things each side has done to one another. Uh, some things can be too hard to forgive and forget. Um, Anyway, that's all I have for you today. And if I've missed any international news stories, please let me know. I can be reached via my email, todayintheworld2024@gmail.com, no capitals, or in the comment section of wherever you watch this, on YouTube, on Rumble, on Spotify, if you listen to this on Spotify. Also, a lot of this news I got, actually all of it, came from Ground News. I really like Ground News. I think their political bias can be a little off sometimes, but anyway, I hope this was informative and that you listen to me next time. I'll continue to monitor these stories and let you know what's happening today in the world.